If you've ever been to a store and purchased something like an iPhone with a bunch of cash, you are part of a global economy that is much deeper than that single purchase. That global economy is based on two principles, and that is trust and confidence. You as a customer trust the store to sell you something at a reasonable price, and the store has to have confidence that those pieces of paper that you gave them, they have value. Well, what happens when that trust and confidence breaks down? And it breaks down for a period of 10 years. Well, that's our focus for today. Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and we are looking at the fourth video in our series, To What Extent Was the League of Nations a Success? This is our third focus point. How far did the Depression make the work of the League more difficult? When we talk about the World Depression of the 1930s, a lot of economists all over the world will argue on what really caused it. And that's really not our focus today. What our focus is to talk about how this depression affected the work of the League of Nations in their effort to try to keep the peace. But before we begin, let's just talk about some key ideas behind the World Depression. For example, there was a great deal of unemployment during this time period. There was a lot of falling prices. Values that people thought that they had turned out to be a lot less than they had. There were lots of closures of banks. There was reduction in trade between nations. Economies of governments and businesses shrunk, became much smaller, and overall there was a great deal of panic among people and eroding trust and confidence among each other. So that's the framework of our discussion today as we look at the Great Depression. In the question, how far did the Depression make the work of the League of Nations more difficult? Now, for today's purposes, we are going to look at the League's work in 5 different areas. We're going to look at weak nations, the rise of extremists. We're going to take a look at collective security. You might remember that from our last video. The rise of Japan, and then finally, raw materials. Now, as we go through the information today, I hope that you don't feel like you're being cheated, because some of the topics we're going to just talk about very briefly and then move on. And one of the reasons why some of the information is a little brief is that when we get into our next focus point, we will go into some of the details much closer. And also, chapter 3 of our textbook also talks about the collapse of peace of the 1930s. So we'll tic-tac-toe back to many of these topics again. So once again, don't feel like you're being cheated. Let's talk about weak nations. So with shrinking economies, weak nations perhaps suffered more than larger, stronger countries. And weak nations really had to make a choice. How should we spend the small amount of money that we have? Food comes to mind, roads and infrastructure, and things like education. All of these things make sense. What about soldiers, tanks, and guns? In many ways, the Depression and shrinking economies made it impossible for small, weak nations to buy these items or produce them. In other words, one of the things that happens during the time of the Great Depression is that small, weak nations become weaker because they can no longer defend themselves from outside forces. This is also a time, of course, of the rise of extremists. And we're going to talk about 3 particular countries in this unit, and that is Italy, the man on the far left, Benito Mussolini, El Duce, the leader of fascist Italy, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, and then the man on the right, which you may not know as well, his name is Tojo, and he was a military leader of the Empire of Japan. We'll come back to all of these individuals a little later. Now, let's talk about that collective security idea from our last chapter. Remember the concept that economies are based on trade? The more you sell, the more you can buy, the larger your economy. But what was the idea of collective security? Well, when a nation does something that they shouldn't have, they've done something wrong, then you slap them with sanctions and you decide not to trade with them. One of the big problems of the World Depression is that these two concepts are opposed to each other. So even if countries were doing things that they should have been penalized for, other nations didn't want to actually impose sanctions because it hurt their own economy as well. So it was one of those situations where nations had to turn or look the other way during this time period. This was also a very important time in which Japan began to build its empire, training soldiers, building airplanes, building battleships, and this was a part of its Pan-Asia movement to create a united Asia, a sort of a us and them situation in which Japan would lead the Asian nations against the forces of the West. Now, in order to build an empire, you need raw materials. Here is a hypothetical question. If you were stranded on a desert island, what would you rather have? A cow, some corn, and some chickens, or a pile of money? Well, more than likely, you would have selected the cow, the corn, and the chicken because those are things that you can use. Piles of money are good for starting fires, and that's about it. Well, during the Great Depression, one of the things that happened is that there was a stronger emphasis on material goods, things that people could use, things like food. Food is good, you know. So countries that didn't have raw materials had to find them. Now, foodstuffs are important, of course, but there are other raw materials. Countries like Japan needed things like steel to build battleships and airplanes. They needed petroleum to fuel those aircraft, and they needed rubber for things like tires and other things. All of these things are a part of the military buildup of the Empire of Japan. Now, Japan didn't have a lot of these resources itself, so it had to find these resources. And if the countries are unwilling to give them the resources, how do you think Japan is going to get them? That, of course, is a leading question. So that's our short unit and our discussion for this video. Once again, we're going to come back and talk about many of these issues again, but I just wanted to set the stage for a better understanding of what is happening during the time of the World Depression and how it set up the League for its eventual failure. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk more in class.